And welcome to the next in the tutorial series, which will have to do with Boolean Add. This is Unit 2C, and basically what we're going to do is we're going to sort of complement what we talked about the other day with Boolean Subtract, where we carve pieces out of something. In this case, we're actually going to construct what really is a composite object, but it is an object in its own right. And so basically what we're going to do is we're going to add one structure to another. And the object that we're going to build is a common jack. Now if you look at what a jack looks like, you can see it's basically an X shape in the three-dimensional sense. And this is a relatively easy object to build. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about building the center structure here, and then these cross pieces, and of course the circular parts on the end. And then in the following unit we'll give those surfaces, and we'll create the first scene. Okay, so here we are in the modeler interface, and what we're going to do first is we're going to create a cylinder. Now to create a cylinder, the easiest way that I know of doing that is to actually start with a disk. And so if you go into the Create tab and we look at disk, turn disk on, and so what we're going to do is we're going to make a cylinder that goes straight up and down. And so I'm going to draw a circle here looking down from the top, and if I go to this back view, if I stretch it up, I can make it go up and so forth. Now notice this cylinder has segments and edges. We'll talk about that in a minute. Now I want to make that a little bit longer, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to scoot that out a little bit and stretch it out a little bit more, and let's say that for now that will be sufficient. So if you look over here in the perspective view, we can see that we have a nice cylinder. Okay, so I'm going to go into numeric pad, and on numeric pad you'll notice first of all we have well, a radius. Let's start here. Now the radius is not perfect. The radius is 850 by 700, which means that if you look at it over here, it's not completely round. Now it doesn't really have to be, but in this case I want it to be. So I'm just going to take this value here and change it to 700, and you can see it made a little bit of a difference there. And this one has to do with the height, and so we'll go ahead and leave that alone because that's fine. You'll also notice that segments, we can manipulate that. We want to have segments. We don't want to turn those off, because we're going to want to bend this. I'm going to show you that in a minute. But let's make sure we have enough structure there so that we can work with it. And the reason why that's important is because complex curves and things like that are made out of a series of very small polygons. And if you don't allow those polygons to be created, you cannot bend something. So suffice it to say, that's what we need. We're going to center this now, and you'll notice that it is well, actually, it's pretty close. But this one unit here, we'll go ahead and change that as well. So all of the unit is now perfectly centered around everything, and that should be sufficient for now. So the first thing we're going to do, I'll turn off disk. First thing we're going to do is look at this structure as the first part. So if I go back to this briefly, if we're looking at jacks, we notice that a jack has a centerpiece which is wide in the center and narrow on the ends. And if we look at these are pretty tall. If I go back and compare that to this, maybe that needs to be a little shorter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to shorten this just a little bit. So I'm going to go into the Modify tab, and I'm going to go to Stretch. And here, if I were to stretch it up here, I would do something ridiculous like that, which I'm not going to do. If I were to stretch it down here, on the other hand, I can make it just a little bit shorter, so it's kind of unstretching it, but that's about good. So that's going to be about the proportions that I'm looking for. Okay, so I'm going to turn off stretch, and what I want to do is I want to create that effect where it's wider in the center than it is in the top and bottom. And so to do that, I'm going to select about half of those points. So I'm going to draw around that half. And there we are. So the next thing I want to do is I'm going to put a taper on there. So under the Modify tab where we are, you'll notice something that says Taper. And if I go to Taper, this is a kind of a tricky tool to use. You have to be on the right axis. So for example, if I'm down here, it's gonna do weird things to it. It's gonna kind of crush it like a tin can. So I'm gonna Control Z that. Now if I'm up here, this is probably what I'm gonna want to do. So if I bring it in just a little bit, you'll notice so much. So there we go. Now we have that taper there. So if you look at the object here, it is now tapered. And that's kind of what we're looking for. And I'm going to be happy with that. So I'm going to turn off taper, and I'm going to deselect those points. And I want to repeat that on the bottom here. So I'm going to grab these points too for the bottom half of the pole there. So then if I go to my taper and do exactly the same thing I did before, except, oh, what's going on? It's not doing it right. It's tapering the wrong end. And so then if I try to go this way, it untapers the wrong end, which could be a useful shape, but not for this. So I'm going to Control Z that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up here to this area here, and instead of looking at the top, I want to look at the bottom. So really it looks identical here, except now that when I taper it, it tapers the right end. So let's go ahead and make that taper. And good. And it doesn't really matter, but I will go ahead and switch this back to where it was, back to the top view. And then if we look over here, we will see a pretty good start to this jack. So the next thing we want to do is we want to create the cross pieces. So let's say that I were to go into the next layer and put this layer in the background. And what I want to do is to create another disk that goes across this. And so what I'll do here is I'll go down to this one, and I can even magnify in on it a bit, and I'm going to create a disk. Just like so. Move it over a little bit. And I'm going to pull that like that. And if I'm looking at this guide over here, that actually looks good enough. Maybe I'll just bring it in just a little bit. And that's about right. And if I go to my numeric pad, I can go ahead and I'll change this one to 700 because it's about what the other one was, and there we go. So now we have a cross piece there. And if you remember from last time, we're going to cement these things together. And so what I'm going to do is, like usual, I'm going to start with a layer 2, and I'm going to put a layer 1, and I'm going to put layer 2 in the background. So normally in the Boolean subtract, this would be the cutting layer. Now we're just adding them together. Technically it doesn't matter which way we do this, but this is a little bit easier to see. So I'm going to do a Boolean add, not subtract, but add. And if I hit that, you'll notice that something happened. And if I turn off layer 2, now I can see that this shape is basically welded together. So we don't technically need layer 2 anymore, except if we're going to do the same thing, we might as well use it to our advantage. So if I go here, what I want to do is I want to move that, rotate it in such a way that it is in the same position. And so if I rotate it on this axis, nothing happens at all. Actually, technically something does. I'm twisting it. Not that that matters. Now if I rotate it on this axis, you see it kind of works, but this isn't really what you want to do. So essentially that's the wrong axis, so I'll Control Z that. If I rotate it on this axis though, that works out really well. That's what we want. Now if you look down in the bottom corner here, the bottom left hand corner, you will see the angle is listed. So I'm going to line that up with 90 degrees. So now we're getting somewhere. And then I'll go ahead and go in layer 1, put that in the background, and go to construct, and I'm going to do my Boolean add. And so now if I'm in layer 1, you see that I get this jack shape, and that's basically what we need to do. So I'm going to go over here and just get rid of that. We don't need that anymore. But we want to put those little balls on the end, and so that's going to be relatively easy. So what we do is we go to create ball, and it doesn't really matter where we do this, but let's say we want to make that ball out like that. And what I could do is go to my numeric tab and make sure that it's a true ball, and lo and behold it is. And that's actually pretty good. Now I'm not going to center this because, well, actually, yeah, let's go ahead and center it to make it a little bit easier to work on this later. So 0, 0, and 0. So now it's in the center, and all I'm going to do is just drag this laterally over here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into polygon mode, and I'm going to highlight this. I'm going to go to edit copy and edit paste and modify move, and I'm going to drag this right on over to there. So I'm going to just try to move that in so it's in the right position. Turn off move, deselect, and then once again I'm going to go over here and do construct Boolean add. So now I've got almost all the jack created. So then all I'm going to do is going to go over here, and I'm going to try to just rotate those. So if I rotate the whole thing, I should be able to just see if I don't select either shape, I'm just selecting both of them, and since they're aligned with the center, that will take care of that. And once again, construct Boolean add. And there we go. So now we no longer need these. So now there's nothing in layer 2. We have our completed shape. This is our jack. And so what we're going to do is we're going to save this object. But before we do that, let's establish a surface. Now there's a default surface which we can normally use, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if we want to make it a little bit more obvious, let's just say, first of all, go to turn off rotate. Let's just say that I select all of the polygons, go to my surface, and I'm just going to call that jack. So that will cover the actual surface. Okay, now one other thing. You can't really have jacks without a ball to bounce with them. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make a new object. And I'm going to, basically that'll be really quick. I'm just going to go to create, make a ball, and it'll be a slightly larger ball, like so. And in this particular case, I'm going to add a little bit more geometry to it. Since I can, I'm going to go into numeric mode and make sure that it's a perfect sphere. So let's see, 50, 50, and 50. Okay, and I'm going to center it, and I'm going to add more sides to it. Give it a little bit more geometry so that it comes out looking smoother. And that'll be fine. So I'm going to save this one as ball. And let's go ahead and select those, give it a surface name. I'm going to call it ball. And this ball is going to be red because I've noticed that most of them are. Let's see. That's good enough red for now. And there we go. So I'm going to save both of these. Save object. And on the desktop, I'm going to call this ball. And then go up here. See, ball is listed there. You can have a lot of objects open. And I'm going to open up the other object, the jack, which we're now going to name. Save object. And I'm going to call that jack. And there it is. Okay, so we're going to make one other object, and this will be because we're going to create a scene which is going to have the jacks and the ball on some kind of a surface, but technically we don't have one. So I'm going to make a new object, and I'm just going to make a floor for this. It's a very, very simple object. So I'm going to create a box, looking down from the top, and I'm just going to make that nice and huge. So I'm going to stretch that off to the side. Now I'm sure there's other ways of doing this, but I've sort of gotten in the habit of doing it this way. So I'm just going to make a very big box. And I'm going to give it just a little bit of depth. It doesn't even need depth, but we'll give it that much anyway. And I'm going to save that object. And I'm just going to call that floor. And so we have our jack, which is now kind of small to see. There's our jack, there's our ball, and there's our floor. Okay, and in the next exercise we will put these together into a scene.